Welcome to another T-Rex Talk. This is Isaac Botkin, and today we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence. Now, you may be wondering why we're talking about artificial intelligence on a podcast that is primarily about the citizens' defense industry and shooting and holster making, but you already downloaded the podcast. You're already listening to it. You probably already figured it out. We've already talked about artificial intelligence a few times before as well. We've talked about potential artificial intelligence tools inside of future digital night vision devices to clean up images, combine input from different sensors. There's a lot of potential uses for artificial intelligence within the normal T-Rex talk conversational landscape. But the other reason that I want to talk about artificial intelligence is it's been in the news quite a bit recently, and there's several reasons for that. One of them is I made an AI version of my own voice, so I don't have to record these podcasts anymore. It's kind of convincing, don't you think? I would say that the artificial intelligence tools that exist, and just general advances in the artificial intelligence area of study, have had major breakthroughs in the last 6 to 8 months, probably more than have ever happened in my entire lifetime. And so a lot of people have been talking about that. But the interesting thing to me is that these advances in artificial intelligence are also really different than anybody predicted. Certainly very different from all of the previous artificial intelligence predictions in my lifetime. So in this episode, we're going to talk a little bit about what some of those developments are. But we're also going to talk about what they might mean, what artificial intelligence tools might exist in the future for good or for evil, and what some of the implications of these are. Clearly, there are some implications with the power of some of these tools, and there's already people predicting various types of AI apocalypse. So that's what we'll be talking about in this episode. And I want to start out, first of all, by talking a little bit about some of the artificial intelligence predictions of the past. While we're talking about potential AI apocalypses, most of us have grown up watching sci-fi movies that kind of predicted this. The Terminator movies, obviously. The Matrix movies, obviously. But even prior to that, things like Frank Herbert's Dune talks about the Butlerian Jihad. This idea that people create artificial intelligence or robots that then destroy humanity or try to. This is a pretty common trope. And that, I think, feeds a little bit of the how should I put this, fear or just concern that people have when they see rapid AI developments. Is it time to start building the human resistance to killer robot overlords? That's a popular question on Twitter, I know. And then obviously the US military and other large state militaries are experimenting with autonomous vehicles, some of which do carry lethal payloads. And so, yeah, I can see why that might be on some people's minds. But one of the things that's really interesting to me is the fact that artificial intelligence predictions are really different than what we have today. And what people expect AI to be able to do and what it can actually do are very different things based on what we kind of thought. Even though there's obviously lots of killer robot future sci-fi movies and books, we also have seen just lots of futuristic films where the artificial intelligence assistants or tools or computers on board spaceships or robots that are helping you destroy the Death Star are just very advanced and very helpful. The computers in a lot of these sci-fi books and shows are very capable. When you feed them really complicated logistical problems, they use logic to figure them out. And so a lot of us, I think, have this idea that because computers are good at computation, this is what they're really going to be useful for in the future. We will be able to ask them some of the biggest, most complicated, most difficult questions, like what is the meaning of life, the universe, and everything, and the computer will be able to spit out a meaningful and comprehensible answer. It's 42. And when I was a kid, it certainly looked like things were actually going that way. The only thing that computers were better at humans at for a while was chess. Computers were better at playing chess than people. And they were better at doing complicated math than people. But we sort of consoled ourselves with this idea that, well, what makes people special is our ability to paint and write poems and stories. A computer will never take that away. A computer will never be better at painting a portrait than a person or writing a symphony or a sonnet. But if you've been watching the news, you can see that there are AI tools out there that are way better at painting paintings than most of us, and they can compose music, and they can write poetry. So this is a very fascinating development. It turns out that a lot of these artificial intelligence tools, particularly these diffusion models, these generative AIs that can make things, are way, way better at making vague, fuzzy things like portraits in the style of so-and-so, or pictures that depict this, or poems about such and such, than they are about solving actual logical problems. And you can see this when you do things like ask AI to paint a picture of, say, I don't know, Star Wars characters in the style of Rembrandt. It actually does a really good job at hallucinating an image that does in fact look like characters from Star Wars painted in the style of Rembrandt. But then there's really basic things that it gets wrong, like how many fingers people should have on their hands. And this is where it's even hard to judge some of the quality of the art. I kind of paint. I have painted a number of things, and I would say that the AI artists are way better than me at a whole bunch of different things, and way, way faster. And AI artists and I have a weakness for hands. I have never mastered the anatomy of the human hand, but at the very least, I know how many fingers there's supposed to be on each one, and I know that they don't just kind of sprout out of the wrists there. So, I guess that's kind of a point for me. So if I had the time to sit down and paint some pictures of Star Wars characters in the style of Rembrandt, they wouldn't probably be as good. And it would take me longer, but at least they'd have the right number of fingers. But the interesting thing is that the AI tools are good at some other things. So I've been messing around with Midjourney, Stable Diffusion. My brother Noah has been messing around with Google's DALL-E 2. But Midjourney is actually pretty good at generating photographs. So earlier this week, we asked Midjourney to generate some photographs, behind-the-scenes photographs from the set of Swiss Family Robinson 4, starring Kurt Russell. And this was really interesting to see because it created images that looked like Disney film sets from the 70s. The film stock and the lighting and the emulsion and the exposure of those looked like those late 60s, early 70s live-action Disney movies. If Disney had made a Swiss Family Robinson 4, those behind-the-scenes photos probably would have looked like this, except for one detail. In the late 60s and early 70s, when Kurt Russell was in Disney movies, he was a child actor, and Midjourney put Kurt Russell, as he is today, in those photos. So the AI is really good at fanciful hallucinations. A friend of mine says that AI isn't actually computational problem solving. We're making silicon rocks hallucinate. It's really good at picturing some of these things and writing poems about things. But if you actually want it to develop logical answers, it cannot do that. If you actually wanted to draw a picture that bears in mind how many fingers people have, it can't do that. And I'm sure they'll crack that eventually. If you want to ask it to draw a picture of Kurt Russell in movies in the 60s and 70s, it will not compute all the data that is necessary to make the assumption that they should use child actor Kurt Russell instead of today's Kurt Russell. Now, I'm never going to be, opposed to more depictions of Kurt Russell with a beard, because, Now, this is very interesting to me on 3 different levels. The first is, it's the exact opposite of what we expected. We expected artificial intelligence to be cold and clinical and be great at emotionless decisions, taking lots of data into account and making very logical conclusions. And these tools, at least, cannot do that. In fact, more recent science fiction, I'm thinking of, it's a Neil Stephenson book. I think it might be Snow Crash. But he made the statement that future AIs will not be able to summarize. They will be able to make conclusions, but the one thing that AI cannot do that will allow you to always identify it is it cannot summarize stuff. Well, these new modern AI engines that we have, these generative text engines like GPT, they're actually pretty good at summarizing stuff. There are some tools that summarize YouTube videos, and I've asked a number of them to summarize a bunch of the YouTube videos that I have made. Videos like Why Everyone Needs an AR-15, videos like the suppressor video, videos where I know the script really well, and I look at the summary, and it's not a bad summary. It does go through the script of the video and pulls out points and They're not bad summaries, but they're not great summaries. They're not great summaries because the AI can't really understand what the main point of the video is. So in the Why Everyone Needs an AR-15 video, it summarizes some of the points in the video. It summarizes them in order. They're definitely not incorrect, but it doesn't really summarize the video in a way that pulls out the major points. It isn't a very good executive summary of the purpose of the video, the main message of the video, because the AI doesn't understand that. It cannot make that kind of logical deduction. Which brings us to the second problem with some of these AI tools. If, like me, you've grown up reading science fiction books that assume that AI is going to be really, really good and impartial at making logical deductions about data, but then you get these AI tools that are really good at kind of fuzzily interpreting data. So the summaries of the YouTube videos are a little bit like those Rembrandt portraits that I mentioned before. They look good in a superficial way, but fundamentally they aren't really the Star Wars characters, and it isn't really Rembrandt style, and it isn't really even human hands. You can ask these AI tools for answers, and they give you superficially correct answers that are very interesting, sometimes very compelling, but that doesn't actually mean that the AI is understanding the issue or the question and coming up with these clear, impartial sorts of answers. Which brings us to a third point that is really interesting. If people assume that the AI is going to give them correct, perfect, actual, logically consistent answers, and they don't get that, that can be very confusing, especially if people don't use their discernment to try to figure out if the AI is actually doing its job and is actually trustworthy. And assuming that the AI is actually impartial and free from human emotion and human manipulation. Because the ChatGPT model that I mentioned before has an awful lot of human manipulation built into it. All of these generative models, whether they are generating images or whether they are generating texts, are doing so from these large training models where they've trained the AI on just gigabytes and terabytes of data. Text from all over the internet, pictures from all over the internet, and then from all of that data, they've come up with a model that will actually allow it to generate text or images. But they're also trying to control the AI so that it generates text and images that are useful. And I'm going to link to an article in the show notes by Scott Alexander. They're trying to manipulate the results that are being spit out by the AI so that they are politically acceptable as well. One of the main considerations for ChatGPT, when they roll out these new chatbots, they want to make sure that it is spitting out content that the New York Times will write favorably about. So they are really interested in making sure that it spits out content that is okay by whatever today's standards are. The AI has to be complimentary about current thing, or it has to be condemning current thing by whatever today's standards happen to be. And you can see these human handlers changing the rules as they go. At the very beginning, when ChatGPT was launched, you could ask it a lot of fascinating questions about military strategies, about which jet was the best, about which jet you would use for specific conflicts or specific missions, and it would try to generate answers. And when I say generate answers, it wouldn't actually generate answers based on the question that you were asking it. It would generate answers based on all of the articles about military strategy that it had ingested into its model, about all the articles that it had read about the various superiorities of various air superiority fighters that it had in its model, and it would try to join paragraphs or fragments of sentences with sentences that looked like the question that you were asking in order to generate an answer. And, I mean, it's pretty convincing. But over time, they added more and more restrictions and controls. So now, when you ask ChatGPT to answer questions about military strategy or how to destabilize a nation or overthrow it or invade it or whatever, it doesn't want to answer those questions. It has been told not to answer those questions. And so again, we have an issue where if people put a blind faith or trust in an impartial, completely logical, artificial intelligence engine that is smarter than we are to figure out the answer to some of life's most difficult questions, they will be steered in the wrong direction, because there's no evidence that the AI actually understands the question. It certainly isn't smarter than us, even though it has a lot more information in its brain than any one of us, but also because it's being very overtly steered by its human handlers. So early on in ChatGPT's life, for lack of a better word, you could ask it to write you an article about why children should not attend adult-oriented drag shows, and it would write you an article. There's a lot of statistics out there that talk about this. There's a number of articles on the harm that it causes, the developmental issues, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if you were to ask ChatGPT to write you that article now, it would say that it cannot do that, and the reasons for that will differ based on the input from the handlers, based on the kind of coverage that they're trying to get from the New York Times right now. And it's a really interesting point that Scott Alexander makes. There's a lot of people out there, I mentioned before, who are worried about AI taking over the world and building killer robots and enacting the entire plot of Terminator or The Matrix or both. And they really want to see AI developers develop controls for AI so that we understand what is going on and we understand how to actually control the AI. And that is actually the main goal of OpenAI, who developed ChatGPT. It's a project that's been spearheaded somewhat by Elon Musk because he, like some of these people, are worried about tyrannical robot overlords of the future, time traveling back, and et cetera, et cetera. And so he has built an AI development business. And OpenAI has developed some of the most fascinating and the most effective tools when it comes to text generation. But his operation isn't really trying to build the kind of controls that a lot of us think that an AI should have. They're building the controls that stop the AI from saying something racist so they get bad press from the New York Times. I realize that that is control. You are controlling the AI, but you're not controlling the actual thinking processes of the AI. You're only filtering the outputs, and you're only filtering the outputs based on what the New York Times wants to see or wants to write about. And so now we find ourselves in a kind of an interesting position. I think AI tools are interesting, useful, powerful, and they have a lot of applications. But as long as they are being assumed to be, or they're being sold as really great generative tools that will create brand new ideas and new concepts, that's not really true, because all they're doing is synthesizing and essentially summarizing all the material that they've already ingested from human writers. In the same way that the image generating AIs are only cobbling together these pictures from inputs from other human artists. But also, they can't make the kind of decisions that you would want them to if they're actually trying to draw logical conclusions about the future or logical conclusions about ethical things. They just don't have that capability. And then more so, you're not even seeing the generic outputs from ChatGPT. You're only seeing what makes it through the filters of the human controls that the handlers are putting on there. So as long as you understand what the AI is actually doing and what its limitations are, I think that it is a fascinating tool to use and to experiment with. And I think that there will be very useful and powerful tools that come out of it. And those tools will, like all tools, be used for both good and for evil. So one of the things that people are concerned about on the evil side, and I think this is a lot more realistic than the terrifying killer robot overlords, is the fact that artificial intelligence engines that generate content in very large quantities very quickly and very cheaply will be used to mislead people. They will be used to generate tons and tons of propaganda that will really confuse people. And I would say this is a very legitimate concern, but I don't know that it's going to have exactly the same effect that people predict, because the internet is already jam-packed full of information that misleads people. So more of it is certainly going to have some effect, but it doesn't drastically change the world as we know it, especially if we develop a healthy skepticism of AI because it doesn't know how to draw fingers. And this kind of misinformation really isn't anything new. We all know that Photoshop can be used to fake pictures already. We already know that lying is a thing in the media. We already know all of this stuff. In fact, I think that today's generation may actually be better at being skeptical about images generated by AI than past generations. I can think of a really good example of this. Back in Stalinist Soviet Union, a lot of people would have their pictures taken with Stalin when they were his friends, and then they would gradually be removed from the pictures when they were no longer his friends. erased from existence, kind of like in Back to the Future. History was being changed, and there was no Photoshop back then. The photo retouchers were actually painting out these people using paints and then rephotographing and reprinting the photograph so that fewer and fewer of Stalin's old friends were in these photographs, because once they were no longer Stalin's friend, they no longer existed. In the real world, obviously, but also in photographs of the past. And I'd actually love to know how many of the Soviet proles, the basic low-level comrades, knew that this was possible. Did they actually know that this kind of artistry and technology existed? Did they actually know that they should suspect these pictures that were being printed in Pravda and other places? I have no idea to what level people knew to be skeptical of those images. But today, fortunately, thanks to a lot of coverage about artificial intelligence and deepfakes and Photoshop, I think that most of us know that we should be fairly skeptical of these things. So it could be that the ability to generate lots and lots of images of artificial realities created by artificial intelligences is really less of a threat than some people might assume. When it comes to text generation, though, I don't know. I have kind of mixed feelings about this, because one of the things that is sort of fascinating about the text generation is ChatGPT is able to generate a lot of articles that read really well. In certain ways. They certainly write better than a lot of people, but they also have a lot less style than a lot of people. They're not fun to read. And the articles really are divorced from reality in a strange way. So a friend of mine asked ChatGPT to write an article about a man with 2-inch long arms who becomes the heavyweight boxing champion of the world, and ChatGPT wrote that article. And it wrote that article in the most straight-faced way possible, which is the only thing that made the article funny, is how incredibly seriously the AI engine took that writing assignment. But the problem is that a lot of journalism now is kind of that same way. We have a huge amount of journalism in this country writing about things that are no less ridiculous than a man with 2-inch arms winning heavyweight boxing championship titles, and they approach it with exactly the same straight-faced belief in what they are writing, and that what they are writing is the truth. So now is actually kind of a bad time for AI generation to spit out a whole bunch of articles that are less grounded in reality than people actually need. Because people's discernment is, I feel like, at a fairly low ebb. And as I was reading through this article and kind of picking through how it was constructed and the way things were phrased, it is really, really interesting. I would say that the only reason that it was convincing is partly because AI has gotten more advanced. The grammar and the spelling was correct, sentence structure was not bad. Like, it definitely felt more like it had been written by a human in the year 2023 than a lot of other AI-generated content. But the other reason is because writing has actually declined considerably. And so as the quality of journalism has declined and the quality of AI generation has improved, they're actually much harder to differentiate. And I also believe that for most people, reading comprehension has declined. Even my reading comprehension, as I've gotten more distracted by social media and work and things like that, and I'm reading less, I think my reading comprehension has taken a bit of a hit. So as I was reading through this article, it felt very much like a real, actual mainstream media article, and that is a problem. When AI is getting smart at the same speed that people are getting dumb, that's when it actually is potentially very confusing. Especially if we've all been trained that AI is going to allow us to solve some of life's big questions and reach very logical conclusions that will be unassailable because they are free from any of the human biases and the human emotional inputs that cause us to be irrational. If people actually believe those things of AI and then they get articles like this one about, people with tiny arms becoming the best boxers in the entire world through sheer force of will and believing in oneself, well, that's not helpful. In fact, I would say that the biggest issue that humanity faces in dealing with a lot of AI-generated content and allowing AI to do a lot of their thinking for them is that by and large, Western civilization has become increasingly postmodern. The idea that reality is not absolute, but it is subjective, that truth is whatever you want it to be, that morality is whatever anybody wants it to be. The idea that you can reject your reality and substitute somebody else's These ideas that are flowing around in Western society at the moment make that Western society very, very poorly equipped to deal with all of the artificial realities that artificial intelligence has the ability to create for us now. So I will just end the episode by saying that now is a very, very bad time to be a postmodernist. Now is a very, very good time to figure out what truth is, what reality is, and, as we have said time and time again, by what standard are you going to determine these things?